In Module 1 we explore the mystical electricity supply industry. It is right there in front of our noses each day, but we really don't even give it a second thought, unless the lights don't work. Most of us never really think about electricity, it's just there, just pours out of the socket on the wall when we need to use it. We get our bills and moan about them, but never contemplate that it is a massively complex industry, that employs thousands of people and has millions of components. Despite all this, the fundamentals of the industry are quite straightforward, and I will look to provide you with some basic insights. It is important to understand these as it provides the broader context for electricity in development proposals. Whilst Modules 2, 3, and 4 relate a little more specifically to the Twyi Valley and Mid Wales developments, it is important to have a foundation with regards to the electricity supply industry. Module 1 looks to provide that foundation as it examines key elements of the industry, and reflects on some aspects of the current and future development proposals. Fundamentally, there are three key building blocks we need to be aware of. These are generation, typically these include more traditional gas, nuclear and coal-fired power stations, and then we have the emerging generation sources such as wind farms and solar. We have one of the largest and most modern gas-fired power stations in South Wales at Pembroke. Generally, power generation is remote from the main centres of population and consumption that are our cities. The generators look to connect to the national grid transmission network, which operates at 275 and 400 kilovolts. This is also known as the supergrid and carries electricity to cities in the most economical way. The final building block is distribution. This accounts for the local cable networks that bring power to our homes and factories, typically via smaller pylons, wood pole lines, and through buried cables. The end of the line is power to your sockets and lights. Let's look at the generation process. How do we produce electricity? Whilst you are all familiar with images of large power stations and wind turbines that some people refer to as windmills because of associations with technologies in days gone by, the principal components are relatively simple in concept. You have some sort of engine that turns a shaft that is connected to a generator, and we get electricity. A gas engine is essentially a type of jet engine not that dissimilar to what you find on a plane. With coal, another type of engine, coal heats water and high-pressure steam is produced much like boiling a kettle. The high-pressure steam drives a turbine, effectively a set of blades which drives a shaft connected to the generator. Nuclear is similar to coal. The basic difference is that nuclear fusion provides the heat. With water, or as it is called hydro and wind energy, the blades are being driven by kinetic force, water and wind movement to rotate the shaft. When it comes to the actual electric generator, most generation, it's based on the physics that if you move a coil of copper wire adjacent to a magnetic field, a current will flow. A large generator rotates an electromagnet referred to as the rotor within a casing that has hundreds of coils of wire known as the stator. So, what is happening is the effect has been scaled up massively to industrial scale. So, there you go, it's simple really, an engine drives a generator. I know I haven't mentioned solar. This is a different process. It is a chemical process. Light radiation from the sun is converted by a semiconductor, usually silicon-based, into an electrical current. This fundamental process is scaled up, and acres of land are needed to generate a meaningful amount of power. The term green energy can be a bit of a misnomer. To provide any of these generating machines, you still have to dig up various minerals from mines across the globe, transport them and convert them to materials such as copper, iron, and steel used in manufacture, installation and maintenance of the machines. Nothing is truly green. There are huge ecological impacts for any solution, and a reason why we mustn't allow unnecessary or overcapacity, with money spent on things not used that the consumer still ends up paying for via electricity bills. The electricity supply chain. Think of it much like any goods supply chain. You make something in a factory, the factory in our case a power station or wind energy park. The goods are transported to cities, and the transmission network run by the national grid is analogous to the motorways used for goods delivered by very large trucks. The transmission network is the most efficient way to deliver power over long distances. Once you get to the cities, the energy is scaled down to lower voltages for delivery to home and factories, again analogous to how smaller vehicles are used on smaller roads for multiple local deliveries. It is of note that something has been added to connect our building blocks, Transformers have been introduced at points 2 and 4 on the diagram. These devices enable the voltage to be stepped up and stepped down. All wires used on pylons and in cables have a resistance to electricity flow, or as it is often referred to, power transfer. Using high voltages reduces this resistive effect and increases the efficiency of electricity flow or power transfer. We cannot use such high voltages directly in our homes, so the voltage is reduced in stages till it arrives at our sockets at 240 volts. Time to take a trip down memory lane, time for a bit of history. Electricity has been around for a very long time. The first practical power generation started way back in the late 1880s. Use of electricity developed quickly, and by the early 1900s of small power companies had formed, 50 in London alone. It became clear small-scale, independent distributed generation was unsustainable, and a decision was taken to create larger-scale generation via a new era of coal power stations and to create the first national grid, running at 132 kilovolts. Shortly after this, a new breed of larger power stations came online, and it is notable that Battersea Power Station A was one of these. It was the first half of one of the most iconic stations in the UK, the shell of which is still present on the banks of the Thames today. The Central Electricity Generating Board was created in 1941 for generation and transmission, and relatively soon after, in 1947, the industry was nationalised. Further consolidation took place as over 600 power companies were merged into 12 electricity boards. By 1955 there was a whole fleet of large coal-fired stations producing 90% of the energy needs. Many of these were located close to fuel sources such as the coal mines in the northeast. It became evident that a new supergrid was required. The 275 and 400 kilovolt national supergrid was built over a very short period of time, some 4 to 5 years in the early 60s, and many parts of the 132 kilovolt grid became part of the distribution networks in the 70s. There was huge upheaval again in 1990 when privatization occurred. It was decided that the generation should be broken up into 3 companies: Nuclear Electric, Power Gen, and National Power. However, it was decided to have one company for transmission that would also be responsible for the overall running of the system. This new company was the National Grid Company and was essentially the honest broker balancing power needs, and go-between for buyers and sellers, the generators. In the early 1990s, dash for gas occurred, and with many relative quick and easy-to-build gas-fired power stations coming online. Coal generation declined quickly to a point where today there are only a couple of stations that frequently operate. The first wind farm came online in 1991, however renewables didn't start to grow to 2010 and is now part of our future. The chart in the bottom right corner demonstrates this and shows the changing mix of generation types for the last 20 years. Having a generation mix is important, it helps to ensure security of supply. Imagine if all our electricity was produced from wind and it didn't blow. People would be far from happy if the lights went out, and it is not practical to have masses of batteries. Thousands of acres would be needed to create such storage capacity, even if it were only for an hour. More of that later. What we are beginning to see is decentralized generation once again, and this is causing problems as new wind farms are often in remote places that the national grid was not designed to cater for. For example, there is no transmission network in mid-Wales where companies now want to build wind farms, or as they like to call them, energy parks. Let's get back to our basic building blocks or our supply chain. As you can see, we have generation at the top left, and this connects into the transmission network, the national grid. The map at the top shows the footprint of the national grid, and as mentioned earlier, this was to enable large centers of generation to be created with electricity being transported to major centers of consumption, mainly the large cities of the UK. As we come down into the distribution network, some further detail has been added. We see the distribution network steps down through several voltage levels, before stepping down to the 240 volts that comes through electricity meters to our homes. If you look carefully though, there are renewables embedded in the distribution network. These are highlighted in the amber circle, so this is referred to as decentralized or embedded generation. This was something the country moved away from at the beginning of the last century, as mentioned in the History Insights. The distribution networks we have are now getting quite old, and not designed for this, and many of the power lines in Wales are already at full capacity. The forecast is that more electricity or power, as they say, needs to be conveyed by these networks in the future. So we have a case where transmission network is in the wrong place to connect large-scale energy parks being mentioned for mid-Wales, and the distribution network capacity needs to increase as it is already stretched. A significant upgrade is required for Wales, but needs consideration as an holistic project, not a series of projects where bits of infrastructure are just added to overcome, or work around point problems. One risk is that energy companies build power lines as distribution but really use them for transmission. This is an inefficient way to create the required network, and electricity bills reflect these inefficiencies via higher tariffs. We need to consider licensing. For most, not the most thrilling of subjects, but very important in the context of what is happening in Wales. I will keep it short and sweet. The body that regulates and provides general governance to the electricity supply market is the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, more commonly referred to as Ofgem. Now, Ofgem has been issuing licenses for generation, transmission, distribution, interconnect and supply for many years, and yes, there are a few wrinkles at times, but things generally work well. The challenge comes when we see that a new class of licenses has been introduced. The Independent Network Operators License. The idea is to enable companies that want to invest in distribution networks for new energy infrastructure to do so. It overcomes the shortfalls, or more to the point, it's a way to work around the lack of infrastructure, noting some of my previous points about it being in the wrong place or full. It alleviates the pressure caused by huge underinvestment to date. The wind farm developers are looking to be granted one of these so they can build new pylon routes to connect wind farms, as we like to say. I still struggle with the term energy parks, which is marketing parlance. A conflict arises here as the developers want to build routes to gain access or connectivity to the national grid, so they can just sell the electricity they generate to the electricity marketplace. So, they are not distributing energy to customers as such, it is a pseudo-transmission service, one-way electricity to the national grid. If you recall, the market structure provides for one transmission company, the National Grid Company, so if anyone should be building this type of transmission infrastructure, particularly at 132 kV, it should be the National Grid. The National Grid Company would most probably use a higher voltage design and create a more efficient solution, avoiding multiple 132 kV routes. Ofgem have been challenged on this principle as part of recent license applications, and the jury is out on this one for the time being. Now back to the interesting stuff. The National Grid Company must match supply to demand continuously as demand moves up and down throughout the day. As demand increases, more generation is added, and as demand falls, generation is removed. The National Grid Company forecasts generation needs and is expert at this, having done this for many years. Sometimes there are unforeseen events. At the end of the England World Cup game in 1990, there was a spike in demand, the equivalent of over 900,000 electric kettles. Yes, people really did hang on and rushed out to put the kettle on. What I would refer to as traditional generation, gas, nuclear, etc., is relatively easy to manage. You can schedule sufficient generation to meet your forecast and have some spare if you need it. Renewables make this more complex, as wind can fade suddenly and the sun might go in the case of solar. The national grid must address any imbalance caused rapidly, or the whole grid could collapse. Now for some cool stuff, or at least it is for the techies of the world. You can go and look at what is happening on the national grid in near real time. Just put National Grid Live into Google any time of the day and it will pull up a live view as per the snapshot here. You can see the network's imbalance at the top. Generation equals demand. Actually, it exceeds demand slightly. That is due to electricity being transferred to other countries such as Belgium via interconnect cables. That's just another type of demand. You can also look at the generation mix, and there is no power from solar. Well, check out the time top left, there is no sun at a little after midnight. Continuing to look at the network data, I will keep things brief as not everyone gets excited by data and charts, but you can deduce so much from them. I said you can look at the live national grid data, but you can also look at historic data too. Looking at the previous day, you can see that generation plus transfers match demand. The UK effectively imported electricity on average throughout the day via the interconnector cables. From the top chart you can see how demand changes throughout the day. And when you look at the generation change, it is evident that solar peaks around lunchtime, shown by the yellow line, and wind generation, the green line, picks up from late morning, which is indicative of there being light wind in the night and morning, and picking up strongly as the day went on. Why not have a look at this important site and see what you can deduce? Always interesting to review versus weather conditions. Moving on to the last area as this module comes towards its close. At the end of the day, energy supply is a service that we as the consumer must pay for. The bill is made up of many components, but we just see a unit cost, consumer figure, and get to pay the final bill. It is interesting what the components of the bill are, and a reason why we should challenge proposals and assumptions. Remember, the electricity supplier or developer mindset isn't really about communities' need, it is about covering their costs and making a margin. A quick run through a few of the key elements that make up the electricity bill, the percentage allocations shown on the pie chart. The wholesale or commodity component is the cost that suppliers incur for purchasing electricity in advance in the wholesale market to supply their customers. The network costs are the components associated with the operation and maintenance of the electrical grid, which transports and delivers the electricity to consumers. These charges are collected by suppliers from customers and then transferred to network operators. The government obligations, referred to as social and environmental obligation, are composed of environmental and social tariffs to support the decarbonization of the electricity sector. The aim is to stimulate the market to encourage change. Some might view this as a form of subsidization and ranges from guaranteeing prices suppliers will get through to schemes where the government offers incentives to adopt new technologies such as heat pumps to encourage replacement of gas boilers. The risk of being exploited is high if consumers and communities don't challenge suppliers and developers when we have the chance. We have come to the end of Module 1. I trust you found this helpful.